podcast focused on trends shaping the future of manufacturing. I'm Alexandria Burek, your host, here with A.W. Schultz, two thought leaders with a passion for people and manufacturing. Today and every episode, we are diving deep into the advancements, sustainable practices, and dynamic changes transforming how we produce everything.
And now welcome Alexandria Burek and A.W. Schultz.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Factory of the Future. I'm Alexandria Burek, and I'm here with A.W. Schultz. Today, we are going to be doing another episode of our time traveling back in history in order to describe what's going on in today's manufacturing world. So, A.W., today we're traveling back to the 60s. It was a groovy time. Why don't you take us in and tell us a little bit about all the things that were happening and what the audience should know about manufacturing in the 60s?
Thanks, Alexandria. One thing to think about is when you're thinking about the future, sometimes looking at the past can also be beneficial. And, coming in the 1960s, so just to give it, the backdrop on that, that was the Apollo time. So the Apollo missions and getting up to the moon was a big push. And it led to a lot of innovations that really drove a lot of what the technologies we're seeing today, especially in the aviation and space travel, but also just in how materials are made and the concepts of, total quality management and Toyota production systems, which I'll lead into it. But it was around that time where there was a lot of investments on it. We had finished up, or we were coming out of some different the wars still, and settling into what was a stable economy at the time. And what was marked in the shift is the mechanisms is automation was playing a big role, especially in the automotive industry. Now we were talking about making the muscle cars, and there was dispensable incomes where people were buying a lot, and it also led into what we were start seeing as the early robots in the automotive industry that were first being introduced to it. And I can only imagine, while there was
oh, sorry.
That's okay. Sorry.
We'll just cut that, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll start for a second. Let me get my place. So part of the manufacturing landscape in the 1960s it was had economically strong backing, a lot of growth into it, peaking trends, and like I said, the space race into it. Ford and GM, they were competing very very timidly or aggressively toward each other, and there was rising competition, especially in the lean thinking. So this was kind of led away from Toyota and the Toyota production system. So this, Demings back in Japan had been working a lot with bringing Japan's market or economy back up following World War II, which brought light to a lot of different processes and systems that drove efficiency. So it was kind of the birth decade of lean thinking.
Efficiency. Yeah, lean and efficiency. And what I would like to say too, which I find interesting, is it seems that even throughout history up to present, the automotive industry is really leading in innovation that trickles into the rest of manufacturing. And, it leads me to wonder, why that is. Why is it that it's always the auto industry that's kind of leading in these new technologies and new ways of manufacturing? Is it because they have the investment to do that? Is it because the their margins are, maybe,
margins.
have I would say they have the most to gain from that. I don't know. But what can you share about early iterations of automation? And you were talking about robotics coming into the scene. What do you have to share on those topics?
It was led by, Toyota brought into the lean. GM actually had the first robot in their facility. That, from what I understand, it was in a hazardous area, and it was about safety was what really drove them into that aspect of it. But it also, when you talk about the efficiency framework, so it was Sachaki Nakamaya. Forgive me if I get that wrong. He's the one that introduced the overall equipment efficiency. So for me, that's like a common thing, especially in automation. I'm guessing at the time it was more of tracking what your output was for the day, where this is a tracking of your output, but it correlates your quality output, and you're running to standards. So it's kind of today it's a normal baseline on efficiencies that's well recognized and used, but it's showing where that came on, and it started in the 1960s, and prior to that wasn't a part of what was being measured.
So prior to the 60s, everyone was just measuring output. But what you're saying is, in the era of the 60s, people started not only measuring output, but the quality of the output and the effectiveness of the machinery, and then probably leading into projects to optimize those machines, which now we all take for granted as a standard, practice, and kind of like the obvious thing that you would do in a manufacturing facility.
Yeah, that's a lot of points where you look for your weak points or your opportunities is looking at the OEE, and it was introduced in the 1960s, and I think Japan was one of the first ones that started measuring it that way.
Very cool. So how did that set the scene for, I know our next episode will be kind of looking at the 70s, but how do you think some of these things that occurred in the 60s really just paved the way? So we would talk about things like early computer systems. So that's when IBM got really big and coming on the scene. I saw something in the notes that we had prepared that Kevlar came into the world. And I'm just wondering if you have any insights or any kind of studies or things you've come across as you're getting your PhD, and how those things led the way for the 70s. And then the other thing I would like to ask is also, how did the people who are working in the manufacturing environment receive that, right? So obviously leadership was excited about these new concepts, the lean manufacturing, overall efficiencies, getting some robotics, moving into this place of kind of computerized and digital manufacturing processes. How did the worker feel about that? Was it similar to what we're seeing now and what you found in your research of kind of more of a fearful versus an optimistic attitude? Or what can you share on that for the people working in the factories?
Yeah, I like how you asked that question. And to your alluding point is that everything that I've done in my research, the people were always worried about losing jobs. Mm-hmm. And this is talking about the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. It's just ongoing.
Yeah.
It's a current thing right now, and surprisingly, but there was a lot of unionization that was occurring during this time. The working conditions were not that well, and we've had a host or a guest on before when we were talking about the automotive industries, and he brought up the fact that they started changing their beliefs, and what their perspectives is that we need to make this place safe. We don't want people to burn out. We want people to be happy when they come to work, and that's kind of what we're leading into in today's landscape, where in the 1960s it was, well, up until probably 2015, I'm going to go, because that's when we realized, or 2020, where the European Union decided that, there's got to be a stronger landscape than industries 1 through 4, because it doesn't touch on the people, and that's really what the drivers was with 5.0. So what we're talking about right now is transitioning from 2 to 3. The industrial 3 is the digital transformation. So adding robots, circuits, computers, and
diagnostic tools and everything else in between.
And really, I think in the 70s really became more evident, but some of the early pioneers were some of the ones that were certainly bringing forth on that.
So while you were talking, I did a little query to figure out, were these fears, reality based, or were they just kind of stirred up out of the uncertainty and unknown, right, of this new technology coming out of the marketplace? And one thing that's important for, I think, the users or the listeners to think about is technology is anything from physical technology, but also technology, in my experience, is ways of thinking. Technology could be considered ways of thinking, ways of approaching problem solving. So this new attitude towards automation and robotics and, this digitization is technology, but also kind of the attitude around it is also a technology. And I wanted to see what the employment statistics were from the 60s on to present. And it looks like about 15 to 16 million people were employed through manufacturing, and it continued to actually accelerate. So the fears were not reality based. So while people may have been concerned about loss of jobs, there were actually 4 million manufacturing jobs added during the 60s, so from 61 to 69. And by the end of the decade, there were about 18 to 19 million people employed by manufacturing jobs. What I do think is interesting is that the all-time high occurred in the 70s. So while the people in the workforce may have been concerned about a loss of jobs, it wasn't realized for much later. Almost down into the 80s and 90s is when the first time that the employment in factories decreased in that period. So from 60s growth, 70s all-time high, and then in the 80s and 90s, there was a little bit of a decrease. And I think that looks like it was related to whatever was going on economically. I think in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a huge recession. I remember hearing about gas prices being exceedingly high and having rations on gas and all of these things. And again, there was a sharp decline in the 2000s. And that was really due to the trade shift. So I think that's when NAFTA came into the mix again. At that point, it dropped in the early 2000s. Manufacturing jobs dropped from 17 million down to a low of 11 million by 2010. So it was almost a 5 to 6 million jobs lost over the course of that decade going on. Now, currently in the 2010 to present 2020s, there's about 12 to 13 million people employed by manufacturing. So I think it'll be interesting to keep track of that as we move on, and almost even if we want to get more granular in the data, it would be interesting to see that year over year. So maybe we could update the listeners on that in our next episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think also if there was something I would take about that, it would be fears. The fears, while they weren't immediately realized, did eventually come. And I think that should be a warning to people with the AI age of like, there's a certain fear about loss of jobs. Maybe it won't hit in the next 5 to 10 years, but I think the world will look significantly different in the 2030s and beyond with regards to number of people employed through manufacturing. And hopefully, again, that just goes to reskilling, and we apply those positions towards more programming and, kind of less hands-on, more keyboard manufacturing jobs, it seems like. So is there anything else that you think the listeners might be interested in hearing about from the 60s before we clock out?
I think we really put a nice little bow on the 1960s, and I think we're clocking out here like finished goods.
We're out like finished goods. Thanks, everyone.
This is Factory of the Future, and we are out of here like finished goods. Stay tuned for our next episode of Factory of the Future, where we're exploring groundbreaking techniques and behaviors that are reshaping industrial landscapes. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review and help others discover the cutting-edge insights transforming manufacturing as we know it.